I'll be briefest because I'm last. Bill Moyers introduced that Rikers film. I remember when I was in college, what now feels like a really, really long time ago, he came and spoke, and I saw him speak, and he said, arguing with people that agree with you is like jogging in a cul-de-sac, right? You're not really going anywhere. There are probably many things that if we addressed any one topic, we would not see eye to eye on. We heard a lot of passionate presentations tonight. I'm not sure I agree with everything that everyone said, but I will focus on one, and it's just because I know her best, and that's Rachel, who started by saying that she is pessimistic, having spent at least the last part of the previous administration working for the president, who has lived a life because he believes in hope. I will offer a more optimistic view of the prospect for criminal justice reform. And to streamline, here's why. Because of the nature and the character of the problem, and because of the quality of the people that are now encouraging us to confront it. In terms of the problem, you've heard a lot, so we don't need to spend more time on statistics. The levels of incarceration in this country are extraordinary. The prison population went from less than 500,000 in 1980 to well over 2 million today. You saw an explosion in incarceration so that we now imprison more people than the top 35 next countries combined. And our incarceration rate exceeds nations like Russia or Iran. Huge numbers of people, all of whom are individuals with lives and stories and families. And the scope of that kind of incarceration is almost too difficult to wrap your head around, but that captures how big the problem is just on its own terms. Then approaching it from the perspective of sheer economics, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We spend in the federal government roughly a third of all of the Department of Justice's budget is devoted to imprisoning people. If you factor in state and local governments, it's well over $80 billion every year. $80 billion, money that could be spent on health care, universal pre-K, as the president liked to point out, President Obama, not the current one. That's a lot of money, and that could be money that's devoted to doing a whole lot of good, whether you're looking at it at the per bed level, as Glenn talked about before, or just writ large. Then you think about how this is disproportionately impacting people. One thing I think that President Obama always stresses, of course, we have to look at this problem and situate it in the context of centuries of discriminatory treatment. You can debate the causes, but it is certainly a fact that the criminal justice system today disproportionately impacts people of color. I wrote them down. 1 out of 35 African Americans is in prison. 1 out of 88 Latinos. 1 out of 214 whites. Very different statistics. African Americans and Latinos are 30% of the population, but 60% of our inmates. That's a troubling set of statistics. And so if you think about the scope of this problem, the way that it's manifesting itself in unjust ways on a big scale and on an individual scale, as you saw, from one thing that's clear from that Rikers film, put aside the crimes, and I'm somebody who spent 7 years as a prosecutor, and I think the president always says this, I agree, there are a lot of people who commit bad crimes who deserve to go to jail. Just as there are a lot of really hardworking and dedicated and good prosecutors and law enforcement agents and corrections officers. All of that, I think, has to be acknowledged because that's true. At the same time, you watch a film like Rikers, how many of the people speaking were articulate and speaking rationally in a way that made sense of what must be a completely insane situation? And you think, well, with a different educational path or different family support or with mental health treatment or health care, what could their lives have been? And as it is, they overcame incredible odds, and the captions at the end, some of them were tragic, but so many of them were uplifting and inspiring stories of people who overcame all the odds and are now helping others. So when you've got all of that packaged together, and you've got people like these panelists who in different ways, and don't agree with all of them or all their views, but are focusing on this problem, When you've got red states like Georgia and Texas and Alabama and Oklahoma, and blue states like California and New York, all advocating reforms on the state and local level, that means something, particularly because the federal government is only about 10% of the criminal justice system's inmates and prisoners and law enforcement agents. Most of the action is at the city and county and state level, and there's incredible work happening there. You see advocates who are as conservative as they come and as liberal as they come joining together. So the ACLU and the Koch brothers working hand in hand to try to reform the system. And even in the Senate, people of all sorts of stripes coming together to try to correct a system that is problematic. Yes, many of the reforms that the president and Attorney General Holder and Attorney General Lynch and others, Valerie Jarrett in the White House, spent a lot of time pushing, and the reforms were not as gigantic or earth-shattering as one might desire to really correct the system. But the president always said better is good. Better is good because it means there's progress. Good enough? No, it's not good enough, and I'm sure he'd be the first to tell you that the reforms that his administration put in place weren't good enough, but they were good and they were a start. And just to tick off a couple of them very quickly before making sure we have time for questions. The criminal justice system, it is a very important question to ask. What is that? It's almost difficult to draw a line around. On one level, it's what's happening in the community with police interactions with members of the community. It's what's happening in the courtroom, what charges are being brought against people who've committed crimes, what sentences those people are receiving. It's what's happening in the cell block. What kind of rehabilitative programming is there? What kind of society are we creating if we hope that we're not going to have recidivists? We should be providing opportunity, which is one of the great in education and training and mental health treatment and addiction, and making sure that for people who don't belong in jail, who are only going to develop worse problems in jail, that you're not sending them to jail in the first place. And then for those who have served, making sure that when they go back in the community, they're not just going to have to turn around and go back to jail because they can't get a home or get a job, that they're not facing discrimination that's unfair. These are all part of the problems, and for all the reasons in the film and from these panel discussions, this whole system connects up with big, broad questions about how we're educating our young people and what kind of services we're providing, how we're dealing with entrenched poverty in way too many places in the country, how we're recognizing a mental health crisis and who's committing crimes for reasons having nothing to do with something venal where spending time in a jail cell is going to address the problem. There are these big things. But the Obama administration, because of leadership of the president, first and foremost, and I think it's worth just recognizing, however difficult it may be in politics to confront big problems, the president of the United States spent a whole lot of time on it, as did the people that were working really hard for him, and elected officials all over the place as well. Maybe not enough, but they did it. And so you saw decisions that affected who was getting charged with mandatory minimums. And the president did a lot, and Attorney General Holder did a lot to make sure that these excessive drug prison sentences were not getting meted out to low-level drug offenders. You saw legislation passed by Congress that reduced the disparity in how crack offenses are being treated when you compare them to cocaine offenses, which didn't eliminate the disparity in the treatment, but improved how people that commit those crimes are getting treated. You saw an intense focus on policing. The federal government doesn't control the nation's police, but partly, as the president says, partly because of tragedy, partly because of cameras, there was an unavoidable spotlight put on some really terrible interactions between law enforcement and the communities they serve in the past years. And again, the overwhelming majority of law enforcement does their job, but what incidents like Michael Brown in Ferguson or Tamir Rice or Eric Garner exposed is that there is some work to be done on rebuilding trust between law enforcement and communities they serve, particularly communities of color. And so the president like a Lippman Commission, established a task force on policing in the 21st century, which was a disparate group of people from youth activists to academics to law enforcement officials coming together to make recommendations on how to improve things. And the Department of Justice put its money where its mouth was and gave tens of millions of dollars of grants to communities that adopted those sorts of recommendations. I won't go through a list of all the other things, but even something like clemency, where the president didn't correct the entirety of the system, but the president granted over 1,700 commutations, almost a third of which were commuting people who had life in prison to something less than life in prison. And he did it not just because it was the right thing to do in those cases, but because it was another way for him to use the tools available to him to try to shape public awareness of the problem that we've got. So whatever the reforms were, and there could be greater ones, I think because the world is really confronting this problem in a new way and being honest about the dimensions of it, and because you've got people across the ideological spectrum agreeing that by any metric, the system doesn't make sense as it is. Plenty of it does, but not enough of it, or not as much of it as should be make sense. So you've got all these people coming together, and there's some troubling developments certainly coming out of Washington, where people are questioning the efficacy of civil rights investigations and prosecutions of law enforcement organizations, police departments that are discriminating against people in wholesale fashion. We'll see what comes out of that, but that's historically been a really important tool for correcting abuses. There's more talk of mandatory minimums than in the past. These are things that we have to look out for. But because of the energy on the state and local level, and because of the people that are spending a nighttime coming together just to listen to this issue as you are doing, and because of the real outcry for reform that you're seeing every day in New York City at the steps of City Hall and in communities across this country, I think there's hope. And my suspicion is President Obama would say the same thing, because hope is important and always will be.